Disputes over macroeconomic theory. Now, that is a great class you can take in college where you can take a look at robust disagreement between the last couple hundred years of economists, their actual positions, what the classical school is, who is considered a classical economist, all these other spin off schools, which, from a particular point of view, is extremely interesting. Our class, once again, I don't want you ever to think otherwise. It's not so much macroeconomics, but rather it is Keynesian macroeconomics, or what you're going to be referred to as mainstream economics, meaning this is generally what is taught at most universities. And why that is, well, I hope by this point you probably have figured it out. So, what do we know for sure? Well, Keynes was British, Lord Acton was British, and Keynes heavily advocates for what is known as monetary and fiscal policy. And someone like Lord Acton would definitely not advocate for such a power, so to say, of the federal government to have over the overall economy. What you're going to hear from me is a very brief part of chapter 33, and that is simply for the purpose of what we must focus on with the time we have for the exam itself. So, some things that I have to point out, no doubt about that, and that is this. Is your book makes the assertions that classical economics began with Adam Smith. He is the author of what is known as The Wealth of Nations, and it was dominated economic thinking until the 1930s, and that simply cannot be true. Now, we have not read Wealth of Nations. I actually have read Wealth of Nations, but I just would like to let you know that other schools of thought simply say no to that. So, what do we know? We know that classical economics claims that full employment is the normal market economy, and therefore a laissez faire policy by government is best. Laissez faire is this idea that just hands off, meaning that the economy can correct itself. Now, what does it mean to correct itself? What is an actual correction? Is the correction what we want or not want? All of those issues are kind of thrown by the side, and it's not important for you and I to study them right now, but it is important to truly understand economics. In the 30s, so we're talking post World War One, Keynes asserted that capitalism simply is not going to work under the notion, and rather reoccurring recessions can be addressed from more active involvement by the government in terms of fiscal policy and central banks in terms of monetary policy. That was his argument. And Frederick Hayek, who is one of those key idea and peoples normally associated with probably the Austrian school. He wrote a couple of books. One's called Road to Serfdom that used to be required reading, probably for your parents back in the day. Simply says, no, Keynes, you are wrong in all cases. So the book goes on to talk about Say's law and simply says Say's law is this concept that supply creates its own demand. And that is actually not what Jean-Baptiste said. How's that for a something to deal with during this time frame? Rather, he made the argument that in actuality, aggregate supply in theory creates its own aggregate demand, meaning that the production or supply of commodities in general leads to the consumption or demand for commodities and services to produce those in general. It does not say that if a Twinkie is produced, that somebody will purchase a Twinkie. Other than, of course, if a Twinkie is produced, perhaps somebody will actually consume said Twinkie. So, in his own words, it is because the production of some commodities have declined that all other commodities are super abundant. And such maladjusted production result from some violent means, a political or natural convulsion. That is what he actually said is in his treatise, where he discussed what is now known as Say's law. I just wanted to show you guys the opportunity of direct vocabulary, direct reading, as opposed to, hey, somebody says something about something else. So by this time, you understand what truly Keynesian economics is, especially when it comes to 2021 and what Joe Biden has referred to as the Build Back Better plan. That is a Keynesian perspective, simply that through monetary and fiscal policy, we can stimulate aggregate demand. And in this case, it would be expansionary. And the purpose is to get production going, to get labor hired, to allow people to make income, to be able to therefore consume goods and services, which then begins to stimulate more production, more labor, more income. The mainstream view. So whenever you hear this idea in the textbook and or college board itself, the mainstream is simply Keynesian economic theory. They argue that instability in the economy rises from, well, number one, I sub G, gross private domestic investment. And what happens is there's significant changes in investment spending, which they feel is what drives these booms and these busts. The booms, of course, being the expansionary phase of the business cycle, the bust being the recessionary phase. And you and I have just talked about interest rates and the expected rates of inflation and rates of return that the entrepreneurs themselves are looking at, and whether or not they are going to embark on investment capital projects. At the same time, aggregate supply shocks. We always talk about the oil embargo, probably in the late 70s, wars, whether it was 9/11, perhaps the military going to Iraq and Afghanistan. Simply, these disrupt. COVID is a good example. The agri supply or these supply chains, and that active policy is necessary. There is a group of economists that originated from the University of Chicago. The face of that probably is going to be Milton Friedman. You've probably never heard the name, but it's been reported in the news, and actually came from a speech that President Biden gave much earlier, that the time of Milton Friedman is now over. It is what is referred to as monetarism. So I'm going to just introduce this to you because there's a very common equation associated with monetarism that I would like you to feel relatively comfortable about. Monetarists simply focus on the supply of money. And you and I understand there's the money market, there's a loanable funds market. People have a transactions demand, they have an asset demand. We understand that the concept of the excess reserves and how the Fed itself can either increase or decrease the supply of money. The monitors also hold that markets are highly competitive, and that thirdly, a competitive market system gives the economy a high degree of stability if it were not for government interference, specifically with the money supply. This concept of the legal institutional impact upon the overall economy. The problem they see it is that the government has actually promoted downward wage inflexibility. You and I have talked about this concept of prices, the price level tends to rise upward, but it tends to get what Keynes referred to as sticky going downward. The monetarists argue that that stickiness is due to the government's intervention in pro-union legislation. We talked about that this week in class. The minimum wage, we would have talked about that, is what is known as a price floor in microeconomics. The ag bill, the entire state of Iowa, guaranteed prices for certain farm products. That means they're propping up prices. Those are known as price floors. Another good example. Any sort of legislation that is pro-business at the expense of competition. And of course, during 2021 and all the handouts that have been occurring, this notion that the government is continually feeding both labor and businesses subsidies. And they would say that simply that is governmental interference that is going to disrupt the competitiveness of the market that gives macroeconomic stability. The fundamental equation of exchange. Now, you're great at mathematics. I have nothing but confidence in you guys. So, this is a number, that's a number, that's a number, that's a number. And that, of course, means exactly what it's intended to mean, which means if this M, the supply of money, was to go up for any particular reason, that for this to be maintained, there needs to have something happen over here. So I would encourage you guys to take a look at just a couple mathematical examples for yourself. I'm sure College Board gives a number of them for you. The velocity of money is simply how often the money is used over the course of the year and whether or not that is stable or not. So, for example, if the supply of money goes up and the velocity of money stays the same, and the physical volume of all real goods, our goods and services, stays the same, then that would explain the price level going up. And I wrote a little note here that often Q will show up as Y. Y is very just common notation when it comes to the equation of exchange and GDP. M times V, how many times money is used by the amount of money tells us the total amount that is spent by the purchasers. P times Q, well, price times quantity is talking to me about revenue. How much amount of money is received by sellers of that output? And both sides, of course, are going to be equal to NGDP. We talked about the supply of money and its purpose of NGDP. And what we have here, when I do P times Q, is the total monetary value of that nominal GDP. Work through a couple scenarios. Just think about yourself whether or not you could calculate one if you knew the others, and perhaps what it means in context of a side to a side. It is the equation of exchange that is associated with the monetarist point of view. I'm only highlighting monetarism simply because the equation of exchange does have a good probability of showing up on the AP exam itself. You guys have a great day. And once again, I have given extremely short respect to all the great schools of economic thought that exist out there in that robust debate that they have with each other, which I hope you would investigate at the university level.